Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Manage Configuring the ForgeRock Identity Platform in a DevOps Environment. My name is Michelle. I'm here to kick off the webinar, and we are so excited to have you here. Equally excited that earlier this month, Exit Certified Tech Data was honored to receive the Outstanding Authorized Training Partner Award from ForgeRock for 2019. It's always a pleasure to partner with ForgeRock. Our speaker today is Matthias, lead instructor at ForgeRock. Matthias grew up in Germany when he started his career as an IT instructor for Netscape and Sun before he moved to Norway. There he met the founders of ForgeRock and subsequently joined the company. Matthias has held several positions since then and now spends his time as ForgeRock's principal instructor. Before we get started with the webinar, let's cover the functionalities. During the session, everyone's microphones will be muted. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Post questions whenever they come up. We'll try to address them in that moment, but we're also going to have a dedicated question and answer session at the end of the presentation. We're recording this session and we're going to send a copy out to everyone by early next week. Also, I'm going to share a really amazing promo code at the end of the webinar where you can save 50% on your ForgeRock training. Yes, 50%. Stick around to learn a little bit more about that. Now let's get started with the webinar. Matthias, you can take it away.
Yeah, a very warm welcome from my side as well. Congratulations to Exit Certified as well for receiving this award. Well earned. I can say that from my side. I'm going to switch to my presentation now. Yeah, thank you, Michelle. My name is Matthias. I am the instructor, the lead instructor from ForgeRock. And I'd like to give you an introduction into how to configure ForgeRock Identity Platform in a DevOps environment, and of course the class which we have developed, or webinar, well, we call it a class which we have developed for that, which just finished actually. It's the version B of the class. We already run a class for almost more than a year now in version A, but it has changed quite a bit because ForgeRock changed their strategy on how to deploy into a Kubernetes environment, and therefore we had to almost rewrite the entire class. I just showed you the legal page, which is important, of course. Here's my welcome page again, and a little agenda. So we're first going to look into the ForgeRock Identity Platform, very quick one. I assume most of you are very familiar with it anyway. Then look into the ForgeRock Cloud offering and the tools which are used there, which we'll spend most of the time here. And then I'd like to introduce you the class EF4523 class, which basically covers the ForgeRock Cloud offering and the tools used in a very, very similar way as I'm going to show it here, just in much more details, of course. If there should be enough time after that, then I'd also like to go into commercials mode, of course, and give you a short introduction into what ForgeRock University can also offer you. And you just heard about it. There is a promo code running right now. Yeah, the ForgeRock Identity Platform is comprised of access management, identity governance, directory services, identity gateway, and edge security. In our cloud offering, we are focusing on access management, identity management, and the directory services because those are the most critical components we have for deploying into the cloud. The identity gateway, of course, is also very popular to be deployed in the cloud as well. It is very straightforward, the easiest probably to do. So if you are managing access management, identity management, and directory services in the cloud, then using the identity gateway in the cloud is also pretty straightforward. The identity governance product is part of the identity manager. So if you manage to run the identity manager in the cloud, then the identity governance is also there. It is just mentioned extra here because it's the newest achievement we have got. And edge security, I guess that is an area which is not that interesting in the crowd or for the cloud. So we're not going to handle that. Now, what does DevOps mean? Because in our documentation, we talk about it at ForgeRock, we mostly just call it DevOps, and what we mean with that is Kubernetes. There are many cloud or even out of the cloud DevOps technologies around. It's a whole variety of tools and methodologies. But as I said, in our case, when we talk about DevOps, or when we say DevOps, we mean Kubernetes. I believe one of the reasons to call it DevOps is that it is categorized in the right order or in the right places. So as mentioned, DevOps is a wide topic. In ForgeRock, it means Kubernetes, Kubernetes on Google Cloud, on the Google Cloud platform, on the Amazon Web Services, in the Microsoft Azure environment, or Minikube. There are other Kubernetes providers around as well, and we look into some of them and play with some of them, but this is the official list of supported Kubernetes providers. Well, what ForgeRock DevOps also means, of course, is Docker. Well, like Kubernetes, we also decided that the only containerization software we are using is Docker. You also, of course, need to look into a load balancer, into a DNS or public key infrastructure when you want to go in production with your environment. Having said that, these are not the topics we're going to focus on here or in the class. We do a little bit of Docker because we're going to also create our own Docker images, which sooner or later you probably have to do, but load balancers, DNS, and public key infrastructure is not what we're going to address there. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we're not covering or what you have to be aware of a little bit later. So the ForgeRock cloud offering. If you follow ForgeRock's cloud offering for a while, then you are already familiar probably with the cloud deployment model, which we have kind of extended with the cloud developers kit now. And this is actually what you usually start with. That's why it is in the list on the top of the list here. We also provide our customers or interested people with some sample configuration. We'll talk about tools and scripts, and I will also show you where you can get all the good stuff, because most of it is kind of open source in the sense that it is available through a GitHub repository, and you can just download and start playing with it. You may want to start with the documentation, and the documentation is maybe not that easy to find as it could be. Well, depending on your background, maybe. So that's why I'm mentioning it here. If you go to our famous Backstage server, you can find the documentation. You can also find the product downloads there. In the documentation part, there's documentation for AM and IDM and all the other products. And one area there is called ForgeRock Identity Platform. And this is where you can also find the DevOps documentation. So on the ForgeRock Identity Platform, you will find DevOps, which is currently available in the version 6.5, which of course goes parallel with the version of the products. And there are a couple of slides. There is a Start Here guide, a DevOps release notes, then release notes guide. Then for the cloud developers kit, we have two guides: the DevOps developers kit using Minikube and the DevOps developers kit using a shared cluster. Let me just have a quick word about that. Well, Minikube, if you're familiar with Kubernetes, you probably also know what Minikube is. We produced an extra guide for that. And if you want to run everything locally and have it just quick installed, that's a perfectly fine environment to play around with our offering. Then we also have the guide for using a shared cluster. Why do we call it a shared cluster? I believe we call it a shared cluster because the idea here might be that you have a couple of developers for which you create one pretty large maybe cluster in the Google cloud environment, for instance, a Kubernetes cluster, and then the different developers can share that cluster for their development work. And that's actually why we call that guide, or the situation, the DevOps developers guide for using a shared cluster. If you want to get more serious and you're working towards going to production, then you definitely want to also look into the cloud deployment model. We had the cloud deployment model before, and we have changed. No, it's not really changed, but we're even more emphasizing that deploying ForgeRock or any other software, this is not ForgeRock specific, deploying your services into the cloud is like deploying it on your operating system, which is actually on that machine under your desk. You also have to know, well, if you do that, you have to know the features of your machine, you have to know the features of the operating system, and a lot of things which are completely ForgeRock independent. And the same is, of course, also true if you deploy as a Kubernetes or into a Kubernetes environment. Only there's a big difference, and that is everybody is aware that, of course, ForgeRock does not support the operating system you're deploying to. With the cloud or with Kubernetes, this is a little bit different because it is so new for a lot of us, and it is so highly promoted in our industry, and everybody says it's so simple, which it is after a while, but you have to be aware that you don't get rid of the knowledge of the infrastructure. So you still have to have that knowledge about the infrastructure. If you deploy on your own operating systems, this is totally clear. You have to make sure that your operating system is secure enough and all that stuff around. If you do that in a Kubernetes environment, similar requirements are there. Now, with our first cloud deployment model, we may have gone a step too far and say, yeah, we promote everything. We support everything. We didn't say that, but this was the expectation which we have created. So we have stepped a little bit back there. It's still called the cloud deployment model, but it's the expectations which we write, let's say, is a little bit less. Just do it, go into production, and tomorrow when it fails, well, it's self-healing. Yeah, it may be, but it may also not be. Okay, having said that, we have an extra deployment model guide for the Google offering, for the Amazon offering, and for the Microsoft offering. And then we have a guide which used to be called the Site Reliability Guide, and we used to have one extra one for Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, which is now renamed in the Cloud Deployment Guide, because this is more what the guide is about, and we only have one guide anymore for all the three environments. Yeah, here's an other introduction about the CDK and the CDM, and what it is. It comes actually as a, or if you want to look at it, you can download or clone a Git repository which is called ForgeOps. You can find it easily on GitHub, for instance, GitHub/ForgeRock, and then you find quite a few repositories from ForgeRock, obviously, and one is called ForgeOps. It has got some sample configuration. All the new Kubernetes manifest files are there, and all what you need to build your cloud deployment, your Kubernetes deployment. We also built a strategy for password handling, as I call it here on the slide. What it is another pod which randomly creates passwords, and it's actually more than one password. It also creates certificates for the different components to talk to each other, and also for the administrators like the AM admin or the OpenIDM admin users to authenticate against AM or IDM. So we're automatically creating random passwords. So if you deploy it into the cloud, they are kind of secure with random passwords, and it should be only you who should be able to get access to those passwords. That's exactly what I mean here with the strategy for all password handling. We decided to go away from Helm and instead use Skaffold and Kustomize. So there are Skaffold configuration files. There's one for the 6.5 deployment and one for the 7.0 deployment. This, of course, again, is referring to product releases from ForgeRock. And there is sample customization files, which also partly split into 6.5 and 7. Why do I talk about 7? 7 is only released in a couple of weeks, but the cloud strategy or the Kubernetes deployment is very, very similar now between 6.5 and 7. As I said, if you follow us on our Kubernetes deployment strategy for a while, then you may remember that we started with Helm, but for some reason we wanted to get rid of Helm. And so when they did the development for 7, they decided to do everything with Skaffold and Kustomize. That was so successful that our engineers decided that we kind of backport that strategy also to a 6.5, and therefore 6.5, or the 6.5 strategy was moved from Helm into Skaffold and customization. And I'll have a word about what is Skaffold and what is customization just in a few minutes. Before that, I'd like to give you a short overview. What is the CDK, the Cloud Developers Kit, versus the Cloud Deployment Model? So as the name says, the Cloud Developers Kit is for developers and really to start with and start developing, and you should very quickly have an environment which is already looking like ForgeRock and is ForgeRock, and you can connect to and you can start playing with it, testing it out, as well as starting to develop with it. And as I mentioned before, there is two strategies. You can actually have it on the shared cluster here, or you can even have it smaller or cheaper if you want, and by deploying it into your Minikube cluster, which you have running on your laptop, for instance. So you first need to create a cluster there. Once that is done, and this is kind of a prerequisite for the CDK, we assume that somebody, maybe yourself or an administrator, has created the cluster already, and you only need to deploy the ForgeRock Identity Platform, which means basically you just download the ForgeOps Git repository, change directory into it, run Skaffold dev. If you run it against 6.5, you also have to specifically mention the Skaffold dev 6.5 YAML file. And then it deploys everything, and everything should be fine, and everything should be working if your cluster is big enough, let's say. And then you can access the platform, the UIs, and start playing with it. So it's a minimal sample deployment for development purposes. It includes, worth mentioning, includes fully integrated AM, IAM, and directory server installs. I'll go into the components a little bit later as well. You may also find IG there, but it is only, actually we basically only create the Docker image, and we have commented out from the customization files already the deployment of IG, but it is really straightforward. The question is just how do you use IG, and then you also need to have a resource usually which you want to protect with your IG, and therefore we took it out of that simple or straightforward deployment. It's big enough. It's deployed by developers who then access AM's and IDM's GUI, consoles, and REST APIs to configure the platform or to just play with the platform. And the emphasis is really playing with the platform. This is way not production, not even benchmark ready. Now, you don't run benchmarks on Minikube. If you talk about the CDM, the main difference actually, I would say, is this step here, running lightweight benchmarks. So the CDM is really an environment now which should be good enough to run benchmarks against it. Now, of course, if you run benchmarks against it, then you probably also want to change the configuration. You don't want to rely on the regular configuration that comes from ForgeRock. You, of course, have to get a configuration which is as close as possible to your configuration, the one you want to go into production with. So we need to set up, or we need to have set up a cluster. Maybe an administrator has set up a cluster for you already. If not, we provide you with some Pulumi scripts this time, which will create a cluster. And we have 3 different clusters, and you may also, again, be familiar with that from the older model. There is small, medium, and large. Where small used to focus on 1 million entries, medium on 10 million entries, and large on 100 million entries. We don't use these words anymore, or these dimensions anymore, for small, medium, and large, but you can roughly estimate that is what we have in focus for those 3 different sizes. So you need to create a cluster, and when you run your Pulumi script to create the cluster, be careful, because the Pulumi script you can feed, actually you can even start with a mini, that is what we use in training, honestly, or with small, or with medium, or with large. You may say, why not going large, have everything deployed, and then you don't have a problem with sizing. Well, your credit card may have a problem with sizing, or your boss's credit card, because the Google or the other cloud providers will charge you quite a bit for that. So be a bit careful when you run the Pulumi script, and look into maybe the Pulumi script and check what is the size of the cluster it will create for you. So having the cluster created, there's also an ingress control you have to take care, and maybe a cert manager you want to take care of. And then you can deploy the ForgeRock Identity Platform again, which is practically the same thing as we had in the Cloud Developers Kit. Just the configuration we're going to use is a little bit different again, but that's not the configuration. How IDM and AM are configured is more about how much resources do you allow your pods to occupy, or the processes in your pods to occupy. Then the next step is the same. You just access the UIs if you want, or the REST interfaces if you want, and then you can start running little benchmark tests against them. We also have provided, by the way, with some sample benchmark testing tools as well. And then, well, you go into customization, and then you probably start here by deploying it again and do your testing, or continue with your testing. And again, the CDM is, of course, available for GKE, EKS, and AKS. The main difference is anyway how you create the cluster. But we provided with the Pulumi scripts for GKE, EKS, and AKS. I've got a bit of this comparison here between the CDK and the CDM. Just very quickly, fully integrated AM, IDM, and directory server installs. Yes, true for both. Randomly generated secrets. Yes, true for both. Resource requirement. Well, in the CDK, we expect you to work a lot with namespaces because, remember, we expect that you share the cluster with different developers, and then the namespace concept of Kubernetes makes a lot of sense here. And you can deploy it on GK, EKS, or EKS or Minikube, which is a little bit different. In the CDM, you probably also use namespaces, of course, or a namespace, but it's not for separating different environments. And then you use a dedicated GK, EKS, or AKS, so you don't share it with other developers usually. Otherwise, you may face the noisy neighbor effect, which you don't want when you do your benchmark tests, right? Well, run on Minikube, CDK, yes, CDM, no. Multi-zone, high availability. Well, with the CDK, you want to save money, right? You don't want to spend as much money as you might do for your production or your benchmark environments. So we don't do that with the CDK. With the CDM, absolutely. Replicate directory services with the CDK, no. We don't expect that there is anything in your directory service which you need to have replicated or high available. We want to save costs here, so no replication. In the CDM, of course, we want to have a high available environment and a highly scalable environment. So definitely yes. Ingress configuration, honestly, I don't exactly understand why the CDK would not need an ingress controller. It definitely needs an ingress controller, so I would give that a yes as well. And the CDM, yes, of course. Maybe you don't need an official ingress controller. Well, I leave it up to you. Certificate management in the CDK, we usually use self-signed certificates, which are just much easier when you deploy everything. And they're a little bit less easy, of course, when you access it, because your browser is actually complaining, and it's more and more difficult with the browser these days to ask them, or well, to convince them that you know what you're doing and that they should accept those self-signed certificates. You don't have to handle it. You can handle it, but you don't have to handle it in the CDK. In the CDM, of course, you need to handle it, maybe providing your own certificates. And finally, Prometheus monitoring, Grafana reporting, and alert management, which is definitely something you want in your production environment. So CDM, yes, of course. CDK, maybe not, just because you want to save the space on the cluster. You could have it on the CDK as well, of course. And if it is just to test and develop your strategy on Prometheus monitoring, Grafana reporting, and alert management. Here's something which might sound like a little bit too detailed for this kind of webinar here. But if one or another of you would like to download and start playing with it without reading hours of documentation first, you may overlook that very easily. And therefore, I'm going to emphasize it or mention it here. I have seen it quite often that people forget that or are not aware of that step, and then you get errors when you try it out. So what we provide you in that ForgeOps Git download or Git clone, which you may want to do, is two paths where you can have ForgeRock directory, ForgeRock configuration. And I'm talking about the AM configuration, like adding a realm, or the IDM configuration, like adding a connector, and so on. So there is actually under the config and then the version of the software and then CDK path, there is a complete set of configuration. In the identity manager, for instance, it already has a connector configured to talk to one of the directory servers that is also deployed, which we expect to have some, or which is to be used as a user directory. That is actually a shared user directory. The identity manager will provision the users in there, and the access manager will read the users from there to allow them to authenticate via the access manager. And that is especially important for 7, because in 7, the access manager and the identity manager will be automatically integrated when you deploy them as the CDK or in the context of the GDK. But this is actually the path which we expect to be under Git control. And the path I'm showing here is actually the path that you get downloaded from ForgeRock. In other words, that is even under Git control of ForgeRock. Well, you probably know how you can change that by creating your own branch or so. But this is not the path from where the Skaffold deployment would use the configuration, because you may, that orange part here called CDK, this is only one version that comes from ForgeRock, but you might say, I want to have my own configuration, I call it my CDK, or you might have different developers and they have different versions and they actually, at different stages, you want to deploy different versions, or as we call them, different profiles. What you get from ForgeRock is a CDK profile and an OAuth2 profile. And then you can add your own profiles for testing different things and so on. Now, how do you tell Skaffold which profile you want to use? Be careful. Those people of you who know Skaffold already, you can also have profiles in Skaffold, but that's not the profiles, or exactly the profiles we're talking about. Technically, they are independent. Those are kind of ForgeRock profiles. Now, you need a strategy to make them available for Skaffold, and this is what you do by copying them into the second path here, which is the path called Docker. Why is it called Docker? Because there you will also find the Docker files. If you're familiar with Skaffold, which a lot of you probably are, then you know Skaffold is automatically creating Docker images from Docker files. Now, in contrast to our old strategy with Helm, where the images would be deployed without configuration and then download when they are running as a pod in Kubernetes, they would download the configuration about realms and connected resources and so on from a Git repository. That was the old version. In the new version, we bake the configuration data, realms, connectors, and so on, into the image and deploy it with the image. And I believe that is much more the Kubernetes style of, and especially Docker images style of doing things. Now, in other words, Skaffold needs to have a Docker file that has the description, how to build the Docker container or the Docker image precisely, and where to get this configuration. This is actually what happens in that second path here, and this is why it is starting with Docker. We have a command line tool, which also get from the ForgeOps repository, which can help you to maintain the copy here, copy there between those two paths where you can have your configuration. Well, there is an init, or I call it initialize command here, or an option actually to that command, to that script, which initializes your Docker configuration from one of the profiles you specify. Once you have done that, you have it here, and here it may change. I'll see in a minute why it may change, and then you want to copy it back, and this is actually done with the save option. You can also export from your cluster, and this is actually why it may change here, because if you want to, as a developer, if you want to use the admin UI of AM or IDM, you can still do so, and you can configure a new realm through the admin UI, but then of course it is in Kubernetes in the cloud. Now you need to get it downloaded into that staging area, as we also call it. And you can do that again with that little script which you get with the export command. Now you have it in the staging area, and then you would apply save to copy it back or save it back into your profile where it is under Git control. And if you want to combine the two commands, then you would just use a sync or the sync option. So very convenient command. Some more information about deploying the default CDK, the Cloud Developers Kit. We have 4 different profiles, Skaffold profiles actually. One is called all. This is actually what you would do, what you would use with the Cloud Developers Kit. The all profile is a profile which actually is done by default in the Skaffold file, or is used by default it's a default profile actually of the Skaffold file. And it has consequences on the customization strategy. Actually, it has its path through the customization file where everything starts, and it creates all the Kubernetes manifest files or all the Kubernetes objects. And I said, the old profile is the one which is focusing on the CDK. Do you have a slide on this? Yes, I do. If you look in the CDM, well, from the left, on the left-hand side, you already see we're talking big now. Actually, what we see here is it says here the medium, but I believe it's the large profile. The large profile has 3 zones, 3 AMs, 2 IDMs, 3 replicas of the ID repo, it's a directory server, or the CTS directory server. Well, I can't go into what's the difference between the ID repo and the CTS. That would be access manager and identity manager stuff, which is not the focus we have here. And I have to hold my own horses not to go there because we don't have the time. Well, we're not that bad in time, actually. So if you would run the medium profile, then you better have a bit of a bigger cluster, because as said, it will deploy several AMs, several IDMs. By the way, the Postgres database here, it's called IDM Postgres, but it is it is a more or less standard Postgres deployment, which we just use as a repository for IDM, just to have that mentioned. It will also be ready to deploy Prometheus, Grafana, and the Alert Manager. We don't do that automatically through the profile, but that cluster has the dimension to also be ready for deploying those. The cluster for your cloud developers kit may not have the capacity to do that. Yeah, and also it's mainly, or it's more or less automatic. If you run the Skaffold command, you can specify a profile, and there are a couple of profiles in your Skaffold YAML files as a default profile, which is good for the cloud developers kit. And then there are profiles which you can use for small, medium, or large deployments. Prerequisites and key takeaways. And now I'm coming back to our, can I call it a warning? Yeah, probably. So do not ignore the prerequisites outlined in the Start Here page, which is the whole guide these days. Do not attempt to deploy Forge Rock Identity Platform to production until you fully understand the DevOps technology. Experience with the DevOps technology is critical to success, and help is available for complex DevOps deployments of Forge Rock software from Forge Rock and Forge Rock certified professionals. Again, I'd like to compare that with the old days when we still had our own hardware and our own operating systems and had to maintain them, and nobody actually would take would have a question about that. This has to be done, and that, of course, for your hardware you have to know somebody, or you have to have somebody who knows a little bit about hardware, and for your operating system you know an administrator who knows quite a lot about operating systems and how to secure them and how to maintain them and how to make sure that they are working nicely. With Kubernetes, it's still somebody needs to have that knowledge. Good if you have it in-house. If you don't have it in-house, then you should definitely ask somebody. It's just, if you download the ForgeOps Git repository, if you have a little bit of a cluster, or you just read how to run the Pulumi script, and then you deploy, and everything is fine, you might be happy. And you go into production, and you might be happy until something is not working anymore, and then you're in deep trouble if you don't have the knowledge to debug it. We try to help you a little bit in the class. We have an extra lesson about troubleshooting, but this is by far not enough to really enable you to run Forge Rock or any other software in a Kubernetes environment. Why do we emphasize so much on that? Because we just have had the experience that people are so tempted to try it, and then they expect that ForgeRock would support their Kubernetes environment, which we just can't do, and we don't want you to be disappointed and only then find out that we are not supporting it. Okay, tools. I'm going to talk a little bit about Kubernetes and Docker. Well, very, very little. Skaffold, Kustomize, Helm, Prometheus, Grafana, and Pulumi. Of course, we don't have much time here, so I'm just actually mentioning it. I hope you're all familiar with containers, why we went from hardware to virtual operating systems to containerization. What's the difference between a Docker file, a Docker image, and a Docker container, maybe. What we provide you with is the Docker files and some sample images. So we have an image repository where you can download those, or Skaffold automatically actually downloads those Docker images with AM, with IDM, with the directory server installed, ready to use in a development environment, not in a production environment. I heard in 7 we might even provide you images which you can use in production. Well, you can use the existing images in production as well, but it really depends on your requirements. If you expect that you have the latest security patches of Java, of Tomcat, and so on in the image, right, then I'm afraid you need to create your own images. We are not doing that because there is very different requirements from different customers on how secure those images need to be. As I said, I heard in 7 we may even go there, that we provide supported images from our side, but 7 is not released yet. I can't tell you. I can only, for me, it's just how do you say? Well, it's just, let's call it rumors, right? What we do support, interesting enough, is the Docker files. So if you need to know how to create those images, and then it's your responsibility to make sure you use a Java version which is according to your, let's say, security requirements, then the Docker file which we give you for all the products will help you to easily create those images. And it is so easy that we can even do it in the class. We can handle it in the class. And this is one little lesson in the class which only takes maybe, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes. And then we build our Docker files. Sorry, we build our Docker images, our own Docker images. So from that point of view, it is really straightforward. It is just what exactly is in the image, and is that something you can use in production according to your own requirements? That's the big question that is left. Introducing Skaffold. Skaffold is a fantastic tool for continuous integration and continuous deployment. You can run Skaffold even in a way that you say, watch this directory, it contains my configurations, and whenever a file in that folder or in that directory changes, then just redeploy everything. I would almost say dangerously easy, because a little Control S to save a configuration from your editor already causes everything to be redeployed, which could be a bit a lot for just actually saving something in between. And also be careful when you do that save in between. You may even save configuration which is not even ready to be deployed. It might not even be the correct syntax for that current configuration files in question here. But people love it, that you just actually place a file there and everything is redeployed and you don't have to care about it. You can also run Skaffold in the run mode, where it deploys everything and then it would wait for you to deploy it again. You can look into the Skaffold configuration files which we give you, and you will find it's comprised of 3 different areas if you want. There's a build area, there's a deploy area, and there's a profile area. The build area actually tells Skaffold itself how to build those Docker images, because this is what Skaffold does. Whenever it finds a configuration change, or whenever you tell it to do it, it will copy all the configuration from your configuration folder into the image, create a new image, deploy the new image. By the way, if you want to accelerate the process, I highly recommend that for Google, for instance, you can configure the whole thing so that it does the building of the images on Google. So you don't have to download the base image locally, create a new image and upload it into the cloud. Everything happens in Google, which accelerates the process a lot. Skaffold can be used to do the deployment with different tools. Right? Skaffold itself is not going to take care of the deployment. It will hand that over to another tool. You can use Helm. I believe you can use kubectl as well directly, or you can use Kustomize, and that is actually what we have chosen to use. And that you configure actually in the deploy part. In the profile part, you have the tuple of build and deploy again. And then when you run Skaffold, you can just tell it, use this profile or use this profile or another profile, and it would actually use those instead of the default profile, which is in build and deploy. Why not having those profiles in extra Skaffold files? Because in the profile section, you can kind of refer to the default part. So if everything is the same except a different customization file you want to use, but the build part is exactly the same, you can just for the build part refer to the default, and in the deploy part you can have a different deploy part because you want to do it with a different customization. Talking about customization, what is customization? Well, when you have those Kubernetes manifest files, then they may be working totally fine, so you can deploy with those customization files and everything is fine. Except you might say, well, wait a minute, in my case, I have a development environment, a test environment, a QA environment, some even have a production environment. And they should all be the same with little differences. For instance, the size of the VM for my directory servers should be different, or a couple of other configurations should be different. Then customization or Kustomize is the tool to use. By the way, this is not a typing error. It was already here, not a typing error to spell Skaffold with a K. The K probably comes because it is very closely related to Kubernetes and not to Skaffold, like you may know the English word that is spelled with a C. Same is for Kustomize. The K probably stands for Kubernetes and not for Kustomize, like in the English word customization. Well, anyhow, this is just actually a side remark. Yeah, Kustomize, as I said, can be run again with different customizations, and you just actually specify different customization files or different so-called overlays. And then almost the same configuration will be used to create those Kubernetes manifest files with just some small differences. The Kustomize people had one requirement when they built Kustomize, and that is it should be template free. So the basis on which you create your real configuration is not a template like it would be in Helm, for instance, but it is a complete full working configuration. You're just overwriting parts of it, and you do that by using a technology. It's a little bit similar to XPath, except of course in YAML file, and well, XPath won't work, but from the idea it is actually you have an exact path like a URI in the in the Kubernetes manifest file. And those are hierarchical files, so you can have a URI that exactly points to one particular parameter, and you can just override the value instead of having a variable name which is replaced during the build process. Why is that so smart? Because sometimes you want to go in the other direction. You have something deployed already, a configuration deployed on the server where the variables are replaced by the real files, and when you export it, it will not reverse and replace the values with the variable names again, right? Which would actually destroy your customization, this time with the C, spelled with the C, idea of replacing variables during deployment. So very, very cool tool. I would almost say it's unfortunate that it only works with YAML files, because I would like to use it in almost everything now. Okay, talking very quickly about Pulumi. Pulumi is a script language, and I'm really very brief here, which we use to create clusters in our Kubernetes environments. There are two steps to have to do. You first use what we call infra, which actually kind of prepares the infrastructure, so it will create a CPV. CPV stands for virtual, oh, okay, sorry, I have a bit of a blackout now. Virtual private cloud, I guess that's what it translates into. So it's a bit like a virtual private network. It runs over the internet, but you actually do it in a way that it is virtually private. And the same is actually true with a virtual private cloud. It of course runs in the cloud provided by Google or Amazon or Microsoft, which is everything else than private, but virtually it is private. And you have to create that kind of infrastructure first before you can create a cluster. And this is actually what the second part does. It's called stack, but what it does mainly, it creates a cluster, and that cluster can then be distributed over different regions and so on. This is why you need the virtual private cluster technology here. If you also reserve an IP address for your ingress controller, very convenient, and it creates storage, which you also may need. And the last slide of this section already is some other component. Well, it's summarizing everything which will be deployed. Yeah, there is Amster. Amster we're using, actually this is 6.5. In 6.5 we still need Amster to, if you're familiar enough with AM, to import the configuration into the directory server through the access manager, and we use our own command line tool for that, Amster. Then there is AM, there is IDM, there are two directory servers, there's a Postgres database for IDM, and then there's the other pod which is creating those random secrets, passwords. For some of the objects we need persistent volumes, so we have the persistent volumes here. In addition, you need an ingress controller. We are using Nginx here with a particular configuration, and a cert manager. So the ingress controller is, so we have a front and a reverse proxy. If you don't know what an ingress controller is in Kubernetes, so it works kind of like a reverse proxy, and you need that to access it from outside. And the cert manager you need if you want to not use self-signed certificates, but let's encrypt certificates or real certificates from a certificate authority. Self-signed certificates, you don't necessarily need it, because I believe the ingress would also, that Nginx we are using for the ingress would also do it. For monitoring, you can use Prometheus and Grafana. This is important to mention because from the ForgeRock point of view, so all of this here is customized, deployed using Kustomize. For monitoring, the cert manager and the Nginx, we use standard deployments, and they are so easy to get through existing Helm charts, right? We give you even more help. We created scripts which deploy all of that. But what those scripts do, they are still referring to those Helm charts. And that's the only reason why you find the keyword Helm still in our documentation. Not for any ForgeRock deployment, that is all customized now, but for that part. Michelle, how much time do I have? -5 minutes already?
We have 10 minutes.
Okay, good. I thought I should leave some time for questions. But okay, 10 minutes for my presentation or 10 minutes for the whole webinar?
10 minutes total, and we have about 5 questions queued up.
Okay, good. That's 5 minutes. So I have 5 minutes for the class. Well, it can be done very quickly because what I explained, actually most of the slides were just taken from the class, right? So I don't have to talk too much about the class because we just do all that in the class, what I just tried to explain. Well, let's go for the summary. We have a description about the class, some target audience, some prerequisites, and what's the use case. So, class description: successfully deploy and manage the ForgeRock Identity Platform software in a Kubernetes cloud environment running on Google Kubernetes environment using DevOps techniques. This is what we do in the class, or that is the goal of the class. Honestly, it happens in the first couple of hours that everything is deployed. It could actually be done in 10 minutes because we give you an environment where you basically have to run one command and then everything is deployed. But of course, this is not where you learn a lot if you just run a command and everything is deployed automatically. So it is, we have to go into the details a little bit, and at the end of the first day we already have a chapter which is called troubleshooting. So it's good for the instructor, because if things go wrong or go south in the first deployment attempt, just the better, because then everybody is looking forward to the troubleshooting chapter, where honestly usually it doesn't happen. So what happens is everything just runs smoothly. Not always. I just ran a class like last week where we did have trouble, which was actually due to some things we don't have under control. And that's actually the interesting part. It's called an instructor-led workshop. It is a little bit different from the structure than the classes you may have visited with ForgeRock so far, where you have a student guide, which is the instructor's presentation, and a student workbook, which is very detailed instructions on what you should do in the labs, and it's totally separated. There is a presentation, and then you have an hour or 30 minutes or however long it may take for doing the labs, and you're doing the labs pretty much on your own with the help of the instructor, of course, if you need it. Now, we call this an instructor-led workshop because there is only one presentation and the labs happen within that same presentation. And for the labs, there is only the presentation, so there's not that much detailed instructions. Honestly, the instructions are detailed enough that you only have to type or even copy paste what is on the slides, but there's not all the explanations around it. This is actually what we expect those instructors to give you while or in between you are doing the labs. And that makes it much more interactive than other classes because there is no detailed lab guide, and then people are much more open to ask questions. Target audience, developers who customize and deploy ForgeRock, the platform. Remember, it's the access manager, the identity manager, and the directory server. And if you want the identity gateway as well. Deployment engineers who routinely set up Kubernetes clusters and deploy integrated software in the cloud. So those people who are already familiar with playing with Kubernetes. Site engineers who configure the Kubernetes cluster and who launch the platform into production may also be interested to know what they are going to put into production here. We do expect some knowledge about Docker, Kubernetes, GKE. Why not Amazon or Microsoft? Because we run everything on GKE, but since it is Kubernetes, most of the commands are agnostic of the cloud provider anyway. Skaffold, Kustomize, Git, Pulumi. Remember, Helm is needed if, and we do that, you want to deploy an ingress controller and a certificate manager and the monitoring infrastructure. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge of all of this. It is just, if you are very new to all of these, it's a lot. It's just really a lot to learn in 3 days, and then you may end up in an information overflow situation. If you are familiar with Docker but not Skaffold, you will pick up Skaffold probably during the class. If you're familiar with Skaffold but not customization or Customized, you will pick up Customized during the class. So I'm not worried that you will get through the class or that you won't learn anything. It's just as I said, if you're pretty new to everything of the, you may pretty much certainly end up in an information overflow situation. What we of course also expect is that you have a little bit of knowledge about our own software. So ideally you have visited or similar knowledge like is provided through the DS400, AM400 and IDM400 classes. And of course, if you have been to the IG400 class, not harmful at all. A bit about Linux could be interesting or could be useful because we're running the commands from a Linux environment. The commands, now, well, this is all the cluster client commands like kubectl, or in our case, gcloud as the Google Cloud SDK, or Skaffold and all that. All these programs have to be on the client side also installed with the client, and we provide you with a Linux machine where everything is installed. If you don't like that, well, be our guest, install it on your own laptop, but that is not part of the class. And that's actually why we would like everybody to have a little bit of Linux knowledge. The use case will understand how ForgeRock software can be deployed using DevOps techniques, which basically means Kubernetes, right? Determine which requirements are necessary before deploying ForgeRock software. You will learn that, learn the overall process for deploying ForgeRock software using DevOps techniques. Again, mainly Kubernetes. We do a little bit of Git and have a little bit of hints on how you can organize your Git repositories for development, testing, QAing, and so on. And then quickly deploy the ForgeRock Identity Platform software for evaluation purposes. The agenda, we have 5 chapters, and I'd like to, well, as far as I remember, without going through the chapters in detail. Chapter 1, introducing the ForgeRock Identity Platform and deploy a DevOps example. We are basically following the cloud developers guide here. In other words, we're deploying everything. It's a real deployment, but we don't care about AM configuration or IDM configuration here. But this is, remember, the chapter where we also do a little bit of troubleshooting. Then chapter number 2, configure the Forge Rock identity platform. Sounds very similar, doesn't it? But here we are now more focusing on the CDM. We want to introduce our own configurations like realms and connectors and all that stuff. Then deploying a CDM configuration of the platform. Here we are going, actually I put that together with deploying the platform to multiple environments. Topics here are create your own cluster, monitoring, how we create those secrets and how you can deal with these randomly created passwords. So those are the topics we're going here. So we're going really a bit into the details of what we are deploying and what we're doing and some topics around it. And finally, migrating an application to Kubernetes. An application is, if you have been to one of our other classes, you know that very well. The Forge Rock Entertainment Company, they have that application where you can stream movies and stuff. And they have, at the end of those classes, everything is deployed, IDM and AM and IG, and everything is ready to go into production for streaming movies with the customers. And that is all on premises. And now they had the idea to also move that into the cloud. And this is what we are handling in chapter number 5. Chapter number 5, we're handling all the topics which you have to think about when you want to move from on-premises into a cloud deployment. Well, if I say all the topics, the FEC topics, right? Your installation might be a little bit different, and you might have requirements which you don't cover here. So it is really a start for those who want to know what might have to be done when you move from on-premise into the cloud. And then, of course, it depends on how customized your solution is, whether everything you need you will learn here or whether there are some extra steps. Okay, having said that, last slide about Forge Rock University. We have those kind of 4 different levels. There's the 100 level classes, which we are currently rewriting, and they will be re-recorded. They actually are provided through Exit Certified in the future, and you can actually, just visit the classes there. The 400 level classes are the deployment classes where you learn the basics. Well, it's not so basic, but 5 days for each product, how you deploy them. The 500 level classes are these instructor-led, expert-led workshops. We have 2, the one we're talking about here and the one about identity governance. And finally, the 600 level classes, we only have 1 at the moment, and this is a combination of the AM and the IDM class. With that, thank you very much. We're not done because there are questions.
There are a ton of questions in the Q&A, but
Okay.
just looking at the time, I want to let everyone know that I posted a few really useful links in the chat window for everyone. If you are, you're here for FR 523 right now, I want to let you know that our July 6th class is guaranteed to run. So not only will you be able to enroll at 50% off, but you can also guarantee to get your training in on July 6th. I've linked all of our other Forge Rock training classes. When you're looking at the schedule, look for that GTR symbol to know that your class is guaranteed to run. From now through the end of July, we have at least 1 class for each course guaranteed to run. And I also shared the 50% off promo code as well as the details. You can find all of those useful links in the chat, and Matthias is sharing a similar slide too, but find the clickable links in the chat window. All right, Matthias, do you have the Q&A box open?
I do.
Awesome.
First one, is Oracle Cloud supported supported? No, we have looked into it, but we also found it a little bit difficult as far as I know. So as I said, we have looked into it, but I don't think it's, well, I know it is not officially supported. It might be, but not at the moment. Shared cluster deployment is supported and recommended even in client environment. Or do you require a dedicated Kubernetes cluster? I don't think you want to share the cluster with some other software. I wouldn't know why it shouldn't be supported. I guess you would rather easily run out of resources or unexpectedly running out of resources, because you know how it is in Kubernetes. You really give the authority to organize which process is running on which node to Kubernetes, right? And if you mix it with other software, it could be, well, I would say isn't it complicated enough to have a cluster just for ForgeRock? Well, complicated enough is not the right word to say, of course, but challenging enough. But if you don't install the full stack, I wouldn't know why you shouldn't do that. A hybrid model, we are definitely supporting that. A lot of our customers want to do that, and I believe in many cases it should be the way to do, because we're talking about identity management, which means personalized data of your users or your employees. What we have, for instance, created as a little goodie you might be interested in which will come out in 7, is a new connector server. If you're familiar with IDM, there's a connector server which you can run in IDM or you can run as a remote server. So usually IDM uses the connector server to connect to external systems. Now, if you run in on a hybrid situation, you may have IDM in the cloud, but it needs to connect to your directory server on the on premises, and that would mean you have to allow somebody from outside to penetrate your firewall, which is not really popular with the firewall people. So we have looked into what we can do here, and we actually created a connector server that would run on premises, and from the connector server open the connection to IDM, so IDM can access your Active Directory. For instance, I just mentioned Active Directory because it's a popular one for this situation. So this just as that might answer your question. I can't talk more about it, but it is definitely on our one of our focuses. The hybrid cloud is very important for us because we know that many customers want to do that. We also fully see the reason why you want to do that, and we're taking care of that. And I just actually mentioned one example for that. What is all profile meant? Yeah, I like the question because I also always wondering if you go to a restaurant and order a pizza with everything, does it mean nobody else will get a pizza because you got everything? And that's a little bit with the all. So all precisely means AM, IDM, 2 directory servers, and a Postgres database. And then you, of course, could also strip it down to say, I don't need an identity manager, I only need an access manager, or I only need an identity manager but no access manager, or I only need a directory server. There's another question, what about deploy on AWS instead of Google, as our production is in AWS? Yes, AWS, I believe we have a minimum as many customers on AWS or interested in AWS than Google. I agree, I accept. My slides were a little bit Google-centric just for the simple reason that the training runs in the Google Cloud, right? But from ForgeRock's point of view, we support AWS and Google in exactly the same way. Azure, we have a little bit more difficulties because I believe Azure is a little bit behind in the Kubernetes deployment world, right? At least it used to be. I have to admit I haven't looked into it for the next couple of weeks or month, but I had the impression they were a little bit behind, and we had a little bit of extra trouble with them getting everything sorted. But I believe a lot of things are definitely sorted now. Yeah, but AWS absolutely equal to Google. Why the CDM advises the CDM is a robust sample deployment for demonstration and exploration purposes only. It is not a product deployment in this deployment document. The reason, okay, I try to have a short answer without, I already tried to mention it. The point is we still say that the CDM is a blueprint or a reference model, but we called it ready for production And unfortunately, a few customers with not enough knowledge in Kubernetes said, okay, if this is what I need for production, then I don't need all the knowledge, and I just do it, right? And you know how it is in our industry. You can still run into trouble, and then you have to have that background knowledge. So we just want to avoid that people believe it is that easy as it can be in the first run by following the CDM. And therefore, we just started to avoid mentioning production. But the only reason is that we want to avoid that people believe this is all they need to go into production, and they don't need to have all the background knowledge. And you also know how it is in our industry, especially our software. We try to not go away from it, but make it easier to deploy our software with less customizations. But this is what, on the other hand, people love with our software as well, because you can customize it so much. And then, of course, you have your customized AM and deploy it with the CDM, and it suddenly you find situations which we didn't think about maybe when we created the CDM or tested the CDM ourselves. So that's the background for that. Oh, no open questions anymore.
It
That sounds
looks
good.
like that's where we're at for questions. Once again, thank you so much, Matthias. Thank you for everyone for attending today. As a reminder, we've recorded this session and we're going to send a copy out to everyone early next week. Do take advantage of those classes on our schedule that are guaranteed to run. And if you have any more questions, now's a great time. Otherwise, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you, Michelle.